The dust-swept winds carried whispers of death and new beginnings, as Josephine Porter stared down at the dried blood on her hands, knowing that her husband's murder had freed her from 7 years of torment, but left her alone with nothing but debts and a reputation in tatters in the unforgiving territory of Wyoming. 1882. 2 years had passed since that fateful night when Josephine found her husband's body behind the saloon, a bullet hole in his chest and his gambling debts now hers to bear. She'd managed to keep their small ranch on the outskirts of Sweetwater Creek, but barely. The bank was patient only because Mr. Hollister had known her father, but that patience was wearing thin. "Mrs. Porter, you understand I cannot extend your loan again," Mr. Hollister had said just yesterday, his sympathetic eyes betraying his firm words. "I've given you more time than the bank allows. I need just 1 more month," Josephine had pleaded, clutching her worn leather gloves. "The cattle will fetch a good price at the spring market." "I'm sorry," he replied, "but 15 head of cattle won't cover what you owe." The memory faded as Josephine pulled her shawl tighter against the morning chill. She had one option left to find work in town. With her reputation as the widow of a gambler and suspected cheat, few respectable establishments would hire her, but she had to try. She hitched her only horse to the small wagon and headed into town, her honey-brown hair tied back in a simple bun, her dress patched but clean. At 28, Josephine's face still held beauty, though years of hardship had etched fine lines around her eyes and taught her to guard her heart. The town of Sweetwater Creek had grown considerably in recent years. The railroad had brought prosperity to some, ruin to others. Josephine tied her horse outside the general store and straightened her spine before entering. "Mrs. Porter," Mr. Jenkins acknowledged her with a nod. "What can I do for you today?" "I'm looking for work, Mr. Jenkins," she said directly. "I was wondering if you needed help in the store." The storekeeper's eyes shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, but business hasn't been good enough to take on help." Josephine nodded, recognizing the lie but refusing to let her disappointment show. "If you hear of anyone needing help, would you let me know?" She tried the dressmaker's shop, the post office, and even the school, but received the same polite refusals. By midday, her hope was fading. She stood outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, staring at its swinging doors. Women who worked in saloons were not respected, but they were paid. Before she could make that decision, a deep voice called her name. "Mrs. Porter, Josephine Porter." She turned to see a tall man with broad shoulders and a weathered face approaching. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but of good quality. A silver star gleamed on his chest. "I'm Sheriff Zeke Keller," he introduced himself, removing his hat to reveal dark hair with flecks of silver at the temples. "I've been looking for you." Josephine's heart dropped. "Has something happened, Sheriff?" "No, madam. I've recently purchased the old Miller place north of town. I'm in need of someone to help with the house and—" He hesitated. "With my daughter." "Your daughter?" Josephine asked, surprised. "Yes, madam. My wife passed during childbirth 2 years ago. I've been raising little Elizabeth on my own while serving as sheriff in Cheyenne. We just moved here last week." His blue eyes, the color of a summer sky, held a mixture of pride and weariness. "I'm not a nursemaid, Sheriff," Josephine said carefully. "I'm offering fair wages for cleaning, cooking, and keeping an eye on Elizabeth while I work. The position includes room and board if you wish, or you could ride out daily." He cleared his throat. "I know about your situation, Mrs. Porter. I'm new to town, but word travels." "What exactly have you heard?" she asked, chin lifting defensively. "That your husband was killed 2 years ago, leaving you with his debts. That you've worked hard to keep your ranch, but it might not be enough." His eyes were kind but direct. "I'm offering honest work, Mrs. Porter, nothing more." Josephine considered his offer. The alternative was losing her ranch within the month or working at the saloon. "When would you need me to start?" "Tomorrow, if possible. I've hired a girl from town temporarily, but she's young and not very experienced with children." "I'll need to make arrangements for my cattle," Josephine said. "And I prefer to keep my ranch even if I stay at yours during the week." Sheriff Keller nodded. "That's reasonable. I can help with your cattle if needed." "I'll manage my own affairs," she said quickly, then softened her tone. "But thank you for the offer. The job pays $8 a week plus room and board when you stay." He extended his hand. "Do we have an agreement?" Josephine looked at his hand, calloused and strong, and took it firmly. "We do, Sheriff Keller." The next morning, Josephine rode out to the Miller place, now the Keller ranch, after arranging for her neighbor, old Mr. Williamson, to check on her cattle daily. She'd packed a small bag with necessities, planning to stay during the week and return to her ranch on Sundays. The Miller place had once been a prosperous homestead, with a sturdy 2-story house and good grazing land. As she approached, Josephine could see that the house needed attention: peeling paint, a loose shutter, an unkempt yard. But the structure was sound and smoke rose from the chimney. Sheriff Keller met her at the door, looking different without his badge, dressed in a simple shirt and trousers. Behind him peered a small girl with golden curls and her father's blue eyes. "Mrs. Porter, this is Elizabeth," the sheriff said, his voice softening as he looked at his daughter. "Elizabeth, say hello to Mrs. Porter. She's going to help us keep the house in order." The little girl, no more than 2 years old, hid behind her father's leg, peeking shyly at Josephine. "Hello, Elizabeth," Josephine said gently, kneeling to the child's level. "You can call me Josephine if you like." Elizabeth didn't respond, but her curious eyes studied Josephine intently. "She doesn't talk much yet," Sheriff Keller explained. "The doctor says some children take their time." Josephine nodded, standing again. "I'm sure she'll speak when she's ready." Sheriff Keller showed her through the house, a spacious kitchen with an iron stove, a dining room, parlor, and his study downstairs, 3 bedrooms upstairs. The furniture was sparse but functional, and everything needed a good cleaning. "I'll be heading into town soon," he said. "Elizabeth usually naps after lunch. There's food in the pantry, but it's mostly beans and bacon. I haven't had time to stock properly." "I can make a list of what's needed," Josephine offered. "That would be helpful." He seemed relieved. "I'll leave money for supplies." After he'd gone, Josephine rolled up her sleeves and began with the kitchen. Little Elizabeth watched from the doorway as she scrubbed the floors, her small hands clutching a rag doll. "Would you like to help me?" Josephine asked, offering her a small cloth. Elizabeth took it silently and began mimicking Josephine's movements on a nearby chair. By lunchtime, the kitchen gleamed. Josephine made a simple meal of beans and cornbread, setting places for herself and Elizabeth at the kitchen table. "Come sit, Elizabeth," she called. "Lunch is ready." The little girl came obediently, climbing onto her chair. She ate quietly, watching Josephine with those serious blue eyes. After lunch, Josephine took Elizabeth upstairs for her nap. The child's room was sparse: a small bed, a chest of drawers, and a rocking chair by the window. There were few toys besides the rag doll Elizabeth clutched. "Would you like me to read to you?" Josephine asked, spotting a worn book on the dresser. Elizabeth nodded, the first real response she'd given. Josephine settled in the rocking chair with Elizabeth in her lap and opened the Tales of Mother Goose. She read softly until the child's breathing deepened into sleep, then gently laid her on the bed and continued her cleaning. By the time Sheriff Keller returned late that afternoon, the kitchen and parlor were spotless, and the smell of beef stew filled the house. "Something smells wonderful," he said, hanging his hat on the rack by the door. "How did things go today?" "Well enough," Josephine replied. Elizabeth was very good. I've made a list of supplies we'll need. He took the list, scanning it quickly. This looks fine. I'll get these things tomorrow. He glanced around the kitchen. You've done a lot today, thank you. Elizabeth came down the stairs then, her face lighting up at the sight of her father. She ran to him, arms outstretched, and he swept her up, his entire demeanor softening as he held her. "There's my girl," he said, pressing a kiss to her curls. "Did you have a good day with Mrs. Porter?" Elizabeth nodded, then pointed to Josephine and whispered something in her father's ear. "Is that so?" he said, glancing at Josephine with a slight smile. "Well, I'm glad to hear it." That evening, after Elizabeth was in bed, Josephine and Sheriff Keller sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee. "What did she say to you earlier?" Josephine asked. "She said you read to her," he replied. "She doesn't usually take to strangers so quickly." "Children can sense when someone means them no harm," Josephine said. "She's a sweet girl." "She's everything to me," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "After her mother died, well, it hasn't been easy." "I imagine not," Josephine said softly. "Was your wife ill before?" "No." "The birth was difficult. There was too much bleeding." His hands tightened around his cup. "The doctor said he'd done all he could, but I was left with a newborn and no idea how to care for her." "You've done well," Josephine assured him. "Elizabeth seems healthy and happy." "I've tried," he said. "But a child needs a mother." The words hung between them, weighted with implication that neither was ready to address. "I should check on my supplies for tomorrow," Josephine said, standing. "Of course," he replied. "Good night, Mrs. Porter." "Good night, Sheriff." The next few weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Josephine would arrive early each morning, prepare breakfast, clean the house, care for Elizabeth, cook dinner, and return to her ranch after the sheriff came home. On Sundays, she stayed at her own place, tending to her cattle and maintaining her property. Sheriff Keller, who had asked her to call him Zeke when he wasn't wearing his badge, was fair and respectful. He never made inappropriate demands or comments, and he always thanked her for her work. Elizabeth grew more attached to Josephine each day, following her around the house and helping with small chores. One Wednesday morning in April, Josephine arrived to find Zeke looking troubled. "Is something wrong?" she asked as she removed her shawl. "There's been trouble in town," he explained. "A gang of outlaws robbed the bank in Cheyenne and they're headed this way. I've been called to help track them down." "How long will you be gone?" "A few days, maybe a week." He ran a hand through his hair. "I hate to ask, but could you stay here with Elizabeth while I'm gone?" "I'll pay you extra, of course." "Of course I'll stay," Josephine assured him. "Don't worry about Elizabeth, she'll be fine with me." Relief washed over his face. "Thank you. I need to leave within the hour. I'll send word when I can." After he'd packed and said a tearful goodbye to Elizabeth, Zeke pulled Josephine aside. "There's a shotgun in my bedroom closet if you need it," he said quietly. "I don't expect trouble to find its way here, but just in case." "I know how to use a shotgun," she told him. "We'll be fine." He nodded, his eyes lingering on her face. "Take care of yourself too, Josephine." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in the way he said it made her heart flutter unexpectedly. "You're the one heading into danger," she reminded him. "Be careful, Zeke." After he'd gone, the house felt emptier. Elizabeth was subdued, clearly missing her father. Josephine did her best to distract the child with stories and games, and by inviting her to help with simple tasks like kneading dough for bread. On the third day, as Josephine was scrubbing the kitchen floor, she heard Elizabeth's excited footsteps behind her. "Daddy?" the little girl asked, her voice clear and hopeful. Josephine turned, stunned to hear the child speak. "Not yet, sweetheart. Daddy will be home soon." Elizabeth's face fell, but then she toddled forward, arms outstretched toward Josephine. Her first real steps. Josephine's heart swelled as she abandoned her scrub brush and opened her arms. Elizabeth took 3 wobbly steps before tumbling into Josephine's embrace. "Oh, my clever girl," Josephine exclaimed, hugging the child close. "You're walking and talking." Elizabeth beamed, clearly pleased with herself and the reaction she'd provoked. "Joe," she said, patting Josephine's cheek. Tears sprang to Josephine's eyes. In that moment, she realized how much she'd come to love this child who wasn't her own. And with that realization came another, more unsettling one. She was developing feelings for Zeke Keller as well. The thought terrified her. After her disastrous marriage to Thomas Porter, she'd sworn never to depend on a man again. Thomas had seemed charming and dependable when they married, but he'd quickly revealed himself as a gambler and a drinker who wasn't above striking his wife when the mood took him. Josephine had endured years of his abuse before his death, which many in town suspected she might have had a hand in, though there was no proof. Elizabeth patted her face again, bringing Josephine back to the present. "Joe sad?" "No, sweetheart," Josephine said, wiping her eyes. "Joe is very happy that you can walk and talk now." The days passed slowly as they waited for news. Josephine continued her cleaning and cooking, now with Elizabeth toddling after her, chattering in the limited vocabulary of a 2-year-old. Each night, Josephine checked the shotgun before locking the doors and windows. On the 6th night, a spring storm blew in, bringing thunder and lightning that frightened Elizabeth. Josephine brought the child into her bed, holding her close as the storm raged outside. "When, Daddy?" Elizabeth asked, her small body trembling with each crack of thunder. "Soon," Josephine promised, hoping it was true. "Very soon." A particularly loud clap of thunder made Elizabeth burrow closer, and Josephine stroked her hair soothingly. "It's just the sky talking, sweetheart. Nothing to be afraid of." Eventually, Elizabeth fell asleep, her golden curls spread across the pillow. Josephine watched her sleep, marveling at how this child had crept into her heart so completely in such a short time. The sound of breaking glass downstairs jolted Josephine fully awake. Someone was in the house. Carefully, she extricated herself from Elizabeth's embrace and reached for the shotgun she'd brought into the bedroom. Her heart pounded as she checked that it was loaded. "Stay here, Elizabeth," she whispered to the sleeping child. "Be very quiet." She crept to the bedroom door and listened. Heavy footsteps moved across the downstairs floor, accompanied by low voices. More than one intruder then. Josephine slipped out of the bedroom, closing the door silently behind her. She moved to the top of the stairs, the shotgun ready in her hands. Below, she could make out 2 figures moving through the parlor, their faces obscured by bandanas. "Check upstairs," one man whispered hoarsely. "The sheriff must have valuables somewhere." As the second man started up the stairs, Josephine stepped into view, the shotgun aimed directly at him. "Not another step," she commanded, her voice steady despite her fear. "This house is protected." The man froze, then slowly raised his hands. "Easy, lady, we don't want trouble. You found it anyway," she replied. "Both of you out, now." The first man appeared at the bottom of the stairs, a pistol in his hand. "Put that shotgun down, woman, or I'll shoot you where you stand." Josephine didn't waver. "You might get me, but your friend will die first." A tense silence filled the house, broken only by the continuing storm outside. Then, from behind Josephine came a small voice. "Joe." Elizabeth stood in the bedroom doorway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. The momentary distraction was all the man on the stairs needed. He lunged up toward Josephine, reaching for the shotgun. She fired instinctively, the blast hitting him in the shoulder and sending him tumbling backward down the stairs. "You bitch!" the other man shouted, raising his pistol. Before he could fire, the front door burst open. Zeke Keller stood framed in the doorway, his own gun drawn. "Drop it," he ordered, his voice like ice. The outlaw hesitated, then lowered his gun. "Don't shoot. I surrender." Zeke moved quickly, kicking the man's gun away and forcing him to the floor. Only then did he look up at Josephine, still standing at the top of the stairs with the smoking shotgun. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. "No," she managed, suddenly feeling weak as the adrenaline drained away. "Elizabeth is safe too, Daddy," Elizabeth cried, running past Josephine and down the stairs. "Stay there, Elizabeth." Both adults shouted simultaneously, but the little girl had already reached the bottom step. She stopped short at the sight of the wounded man groaning on the floor. Zeke quickly secured the uninjured outlaw with handcuffs, then rushed to scoop up his daughter. "It's all right now," he soothed her. "Daddy's here." More men deputies, Josephine realized, entered the house, taking charge of the two outlaws. One of them, a young man with a kind face, approached Zeke. "We've got them, Sheriff. The doc's on his way for that one," he nodded toward the wounded man. "The rest of the gang's been captured." "Good work, deputy," Zeke said. "I'll be out shortly." After the deputies had removed the outlaws, Zeke carried Elizabeth back upstairs to where Josephine still stood, the shotgun now lowered. "You can put that down now," he said gently, taking the weapon from her trembling hands. "You're safe." The shock of what had happened finally hit Josephine, and she swayed on her feet. Zeke quickly set Elizabeth down and caught Josephine by the shoulders. "Easy," he murmured. "You've been very brave." "I could have gotten Elizabeth killed," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "No," Zeke said firmly. "You protected her. You protected my home." His eyes, filled with something Josephine couldn't quite name, searched her face. "Thank you." Later, after Elizabeth had been settled back to sleep in her bed, Zeke and Josephine sat at the kitchen table. He'd built up the fire and made coffee, adding a splash of whiskey to both cups. "Those men were part of the gang we've been tracking," he explained. "They split up when we closed in. Must have thought my place would be an easy target while I was away." "How did you know to come back tonight?" Josephine asked, her hand still shaking slightly around her cup. "We caught the rest of them yesterday. I rode through the night to get back." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I was worried about you both." His touch was warm and reassuring. Josephine found herself turning her hand to clasp his. "Elizabeth took her first steps," she told him, "and she's talking now." Surprise and joy washed over his face. "She is. What did she say?" she asked for her daddy. Josephine smiled. "And she calls me Joe." Something shifted in Zeke's expression, a softening that made Josephine's heart beat faster. "She's grown attached to you," he said. "So have I." The admission hung in the air between them, fraught with possibility. "Zeke," Josephine began hesitantly, "I should tell you about my husband." "I know about Thomas Porter," he said quietly. "I was a deputy in Cheyenne when he was killed. The case came across my desk." Josephine tensed, withdrawing her hand. "Then you know what people say about me." "I know that Thomas Porter was a violent man who mistreated his wife," Zeke said evenly. "I know he had gambling debts to dangerous men. And I know that when he was found dead, his wife had bruises that matched the shape of his hands." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't kill him," she whispered, "though there were days I wanted to." "I believe you," Zeke said simply. The evidence pointed to one of his creditors, though it was never proven. Relief washed over her. "You're the first person who's ever said they believed me." "I'm a good judge of character," he said, his eyes warm. "You're a strong, kind woman who's had more than her share of hardship. You're wonderful with my daughter, and I find myself thinking about you even when you're not around." Josephine's heart raced. "Zeke, you don't have to say anything now," he interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to know how I feel. Whatever happens between us, your job here is secure." "I wasn't going to refuse you," she said softly. I was going to say that I've grown fond of you too, and I love Elizabeth as if she were my own." The hope that bloomed on his face was beautiful to behold. "Truly, truly," she affirmed, "but I'm afraid my first marriage was difficult." "I would never hurt you," Zeke promised. "Never raise my voice or hand to you. I've seen what happens in marriages like that, and I want no part of it." "I believe you," Josephine said, and realized she meant it. Zeke stood and moved around the table, kneeling beside her chair. "I'm not asking for marriage, not yet. But I am asking if you might consider staying here more permanently, not as my housekeeper, but as someone I'm courting." Josephine looked down at this man, this honorable, kind man who was offering her a second chance at happiness. "What about my ranch?" "Keep it," he said immediately. "It's yours. Maybe someday we could combine our properties, but that's for the future to decide." She reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I would like to be courted by you, Zeke Keller." The smile that lit his face warmed her to her core. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, a promise rather than a demand, and Josephine found herself leaning into it, her hand coming to rest at the nape of his neck. When they parted, both were breathless. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I saw you outside the Silver Dollar," Zeke admitted, his voice husky. "I'm glad you waited until now," Josephine smiled. "It means more this way." The next morning, Elizabeth found them making breakfast together in the kitchen, their movements already in sync as they worked side by side. The little girl looked between them, her bright eyes missing nothing. "Joe stay?" she asked hopefully. Zeke glanced at Josephine, letting her answer. "Yes, sweetheart," Josephine said, kneeling to Elizabeth's level. "Joe is going to stay." Elizabeth's face lit up with joy. She took a step forward, then another, gaining confidence as she crossed the kitchen floor toward Josephine. "Joe stay with me and Daddy," she declared, falling into Josephine's open arms. Over the child's head, Josephine's eyes met Zeke's. The love she saw there matched the growing warmth in her own heart. "Yes," she whispered, holding Elizabeth close. "Joe is staying." 5 years later, Josephine stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching Zeke teach their son to ride his first pony. 7-year-old Elizabeth sat atop her own horse nearby, already a confident rider, calling out encouragement to her little brother. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. Josephine's cattle herd had grown, and Zeke had added horses to their stock. The town of Sweetwater Creek had grown too, and Zeke now served as its mayor as well as sheriff. Their wedding, 3 months after the night of the attempted robbery, had been a simple affair at the local church. To Josephine's surprise, many townspeople had attended, their attitudes toward her softening once she became Mrs. Keller. Life wasn't always easy. The Wyoming Territory remained a challenging place to build a life, with harsh winters and the occasional drought. But they faced each challenge together, their bond strengthening with each passing season. Josephine's hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, where their third child was growing. Each morning, she woke beside Zeke with a sense of gratitude for the life they'd built, for the family they'd created, for the love that had bloomed from an unexpected opportunity, and a little girl's first steps across a freshly scrubbed floor. "Mama, watch me," Elizabeth called, guiding her horse through a figure-8 pattern Zeke had taught her. "I'm watching, sweetheart," Josephine called back, her heart full. This was what she'd never dared to dream of during those dark days after Thomas's death, a true home, a loving husband, children who brought joy rather than fear. As Zeke looked up and caught her eye, his smile still making her heart skip after all these years, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that some endings were really just beautiful beginnings in disguise.